Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a really simple question. How can we prevent people from falling over and injuring themselves? Now that sounds like a simple challenge, but it's actually a major issue. In a normal year, over 300,000 people in the UK alone have to go to hospital after slipping on a surface. That equates to 1.5 million bed days and around £1 billion, so 1.3 billion US dollars of insurance claims. My guest on this episode, Christian Harris, is the founder of Slip Safety, a company that specialises in helping prevent these kinds of accidents. Now, if that sounds like an unusual business model, you're right. But as you'll hear, there's a lot more complexity in what makes us fall over than you might think. If you want to solve that problem, then you need a specialist to help you do that. The more I spoke to Christian about his business, the more I realised that what he does is highly relevant to human risk. So I wanted to get him on the show. Because what he does is not just a case of telling people to take more care, though sometimes it clearly is the fault of the individual who fell. But equally, sometimes the environment has been poorly designed, making the chances of people falling over unnecessarily high. It's a real case of human risk manifesting itself in the physical world. In our discussion, Christian explains what inspired him to set up his company. We also explore the dynamics of falling and how technology can help prevent it. We look at how the idea of falling over being funny, think cartoon characters throwing banana skins to make their nemesis fall over, or some of those comedy YouTube videos of people falling over in the snow, poses challenges when you're trying to manage what's a very dangerous risk. And we talk about the fact that logical approaches to managing this risk, signs, for example, that say things like slippery when wet, might actually be counterproductive. I also get some tips from him on how we can all make ourselves less likely to fall over. Christian not only shares some wonderful insights, and you'll be amazed at how much more complex this subject is than you might initially think, but he's also great company. After all, what else would you expect from someone called Christian? So please enjoy my discussion with Christian Harris on slips, trips, and falls. Christian, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. I've been looking forward to this a lot. Although I've got a very niche area, I think there's some interesting relevancy to your audience, and I'm really interested to pick up on some of the human factors that cause slips, trips, and falls.
I am really excited to have you, not just because you're the first Christian that I've had as a guest on the show, which obviously means you're going to be very high quality, but the second is I'm fascinated about you and what you do. Can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your business?
Yeah, sure thing. So I've got a business called Slip Safety Services. And we do what we say on the tin, where it's all about prevention of slips, trips and falls accidents, which not many people know, but it's the largest cause of people going to A&E every year. So in the UK, in a typical year, forgetting COVID and things like that, the average was about 300,000 people a year going to A&E after a slip, and then trips and falls on top of that, resulting in about 1.5 million NHS bed days and about £1 billion of insurance claim costs. So it's a big issue. And my business partners up with end user companies, but also stakeholders like AXA Insurance to try to help people to better understand these risks and then to put in place some practical and measurable steps to prevent these accidents from happening. And if you look over the last 3 years, we think at last count we've stopped about £10 million a year of claims. So that's stopping people from getting hurt, stopping lives from being sort of shattered, for want of a better term, and saving a lot of cost for businesses as well.
Wow. How does one get into that as a specialism?
Well, that's a great question. And there's a secret society you have to join. And I was a business consultant before this, and I suppose there's two things that kind of met, and that's where my passion comes from. Firstly, I got a little bit, I wouldn't say bored, but kind of I'd had enough of looking at spreadsheets and helping banks and private equity companies to become richer and I kind of wanted to do something a little bit more altruistic in the world and something that would actually add more value. And the second thing is that I actually suffered an accident that wasn't my fault. It wasn't a slip, but I was run over by a car that lost control and mounted the curb. And so I've kind of got a very good appreciation for, just what it's like when something like this happens that isn't your fault and the effect it can have on you. And if you look at the statistics, as I said, far and away around the world, the biggest cause of that happening is slips, trips and falls. So if you're interested in sort of trying to help people to be safer and to prevent these accidents and injuries, then to me, why not start with the biggest area of risk?
As you sort of started to look at this, how did you go about even sort of scoping out this as an area for a business?
Well, I started just by delving into some statistics and it came to light pretty quickly, that given what I've shared to you, there was a big problem here. And then if you start to think about, well, is this a short-term problem? It's something a bit like a pandemic that's appeared out of nowhere and we need a lot of emphasis on it, but actually it's potentially not something that's going to be everlasting. Or is this something that's endemic? And actually this is an endemic problem. And so you add those two things together, it's the biggest cause of accidents, injuries, claims. It's been happening year after year. The numbers haven't really changed. There's a big opportunity to do something about it and to actually make a really big impact in the world. So my kind of mission, my goal that I've set myself is to try to reduce the number of slips by 500,000 a year around the world. And that's a big goal, don't get me wrong. But if you look at the sheer numbers, it's achievable. And if we can do that, then that would have a massive effect on not only the families and the people that would otherwise have been injured, but also business. And I think a lot about trying to frame what I do in terms of the overall benefits to business, because to get businesses on board to change, you've got to give them something. There's got to be something in it for them. So, if you could do that, just think of the savings, billions of pounds of savings that could be invested into something more profitable, more interesting, more beneficial, more meaningful. And so, there's definitely a big business case here.
And there's something fascinating about what you do, that you're preventing something from happening. So in many cases, if you're successful, it's invisible because it's something that hasn't happened as opposed to something. And so that's something that you would share in common with, say, regulators or the security services. How do you start to make a case for something? Well, I could see if somebody had a major incident, it's much easier to sell it than if they haven't. How do you start to frame that? Because I think that's one of the bigger challenges there of sort of if you're adding significant value, but it's invisible value.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is a challenge. Don't get me wrong. If it were easy, then I'd be achieving my 500,000 already, because there's a big enough problem there to solve. But it's how to capture people's attention and shift their mindset to get to that end point is not easy. Typically, where we're called in by clients, it's reactively. So we've had 10 accidents and claims for the last couple of years. We think that's too many. What can we do about it? And where we have that data of historic incidents, we can typically show at least a 50% reduction going forward once they've kind of implemented some of our recommendations. So we've got proof of concept from the perspective of, we can definitely demonstrate we can reduce the accidents. But as you say, it's the companies where they don't perceive they've got a risk, they don't perceive they've got an issue, or perhaps they haven't actually had much of an issue. And the challenge, I suppose, with what I do is that although it's a big problem, if you think about 300,000 people a year going to A&E, if we plonked all of those people in Trafalgar Square, that would look big. But if you consider that there are hundreds of thousands of buildings around the country, the average building has many fewer than one of these serious slips happening a year. So it's how to get people from, everybody understands the problem, but how to get them to sort of understand the implications of what could happen, and to try to be preventative and proactive. That's not as easy as it might be if they do have an issue. What we try to do is to introduce some science into the subject. So there's a contraption called a pendulum slip test, which is what the HSE use, and it's what's used in court cases, and it measures how slippery a floor is. So if you can actually go into a building to a facilities manager or a safety manager or a operations manager or director or whatever it might be, and say, well, look, let's go and test these floors and let's give you a scientific understanding of how safe or not the floors are. And then you say, right, well, this floor's fine. Even when it's wet, it's got a risk of less than 1 in a million. Whereas this floor here, when it's dry, it's okay. But when it's wet, it's got a 1 in 200 risk. And therefore, we recommend you do something about this. That starts to bring it into more concrete terms that people can sort of start to understand a bit easier.
So once you've identified where risks are and pointed it out to people, what sorts of interventions would you be looking at to make things safer?
So we have a model that we've developed called CHIMES, and this basically sets out the 6 reasons why people will slip. So it's an acronym trying to make something that people would remember. So C is for contamination. I'll run through them in a second. H is for heal. I is individual. M is maintenance. E is environment. And S is surface. So these are basically the 6 areas that you need to look at. And under each of these areas, there's quite a lot of depth that you can use to take steps to try and reduce the risk. So contamination, for example, is all about the fact that if a floor is clean and dry, then it's very unlikely that somebody would ever slip. But actually, most slips happen, 99% of slips happen when there's contamination on the floor, whether it be water or grease or dust or whatever it might be. So can we understand how much contamination is on the floor, how we can prevent it from getting there, or how we can mitigate the level of contamination, because certain floors can withstand a certain amount of contamination before they become dangerous. So that would be, one example. So just under that area, quite a lot of depth that we can go into to try to reduce the risk. What we tend to find is that if you look at this CHIMES model holistically, most people are looking at maybe 1 or 2 of them, and even then only quite sort of superficially, in quite a shallow way. So there's always more depth and breadth we can go into to start to make a bit of an impact. And again, what we try to do is introduce some kind of science and some measurement and quantitative aspects here so that people can actually start measuring and managing what's going on.
When you took us through that framework, it's fascinating because it's sort of, you start, what seems like a really simple issue, actually, as you say, has a degree of complexity and some very, very different causes, some of which are like you talked about the surface. So clearly there are going to be some surfaces that come with a high degree of inherent risk and others that don't. But that really highlights that there's quite a lot of complexity and detail here that you need to think about. And the risk, logically, because it involves people as well, isn't a static risk. It will change according to human behavior. It will change according to presumably simple things like the weather can have an impact or whether somebody's washed the floor. So there's quite a lot of things there that when you went through the framework all sounded obvious. And I suddenly thought, well, there's a heck of a lot more here than initially meets the eye. Are people generally surprised by that?
Yeah, they are. So when I present that framework to them, they normally have two immediate reactions. One is, there's more to this than I thought. And second is, we're only doing 1 or 2 of these things. And therefore, I can see straight away how we haven't quite got on top of this problem. There's definitely a perception challenge around this risk, as you've identified, and sort of taking a step back and thinking about some of the human factors, given the title of the podcast and the content of the podcast. I always say that human factors are really critical when it comes to slips and falls, but perhaps not in the way that people might necessarily think. The immediate reaction, if someone slips over in a pub or a shopping centre, particularly if it's a lady wearing high heels, is, well, she shouldn't be wearing such silly footwear, it's all her fault. But actually that's not the case. And if you go further upstream, there are kind of 4 big misperceptions that I think are really fundamental to this. And if we could tackle those further upstream in people's mindsets, then I think we would start to see better results downstream, on the floor in the real world. And I call that, it's another acronym. I'm a big fan of acronyms. I call it the SLIP problem. So coming up with an acronym of that.
I think it's really interesting when you talked about it, because there is a sort of, let's blame the person who's fallen over, as opposed to thinking about the environmental factors that might have caused it. And I think that's probably, That stems, I guess, partly from a legal liability thinking. If we can focus it on blaming them, we're less liable for the issue, and we probably don't have to solve the problem, don't have to worry about it. And I think there's something natural as well in human tendency. It's sort of, if something happens to you, well, you must have done something for that to be the case, and particularly where that's relating to a location. And I guess particularly when people are walking, they have a choice. Implicitly, they have a choice of where they walk. So there is something interestingly psychological here where there would be a legal and a sort of natural tendency, I guess, to blame the person that's fallen over as opposed to start to focus on the environment.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, these factors, human factors, do have a role, and that's I, individual, in chimes. So if we are walking at a normal speed in a straight line, then we require a certain amount of friction to be safe. But as soon as we start doing things that are kind of non-standard, so going a bit faster or pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, carrying, then we need kind of more friction to be safe. So to some extent, yes, there is an element of, well, if we're doing any of those things, we're heightening the risk for ourselves. Now, of course, if we're a member of the public, that's one thing. But if we're a member of staff at work and part of our job is we're working in a kitchen and we've got to carry trays of food and we've got to turn around a corner in the kitchen to get from the workstation to the pass where the food's going to be served, well, that's not within our control. So, that's an example of where the person might be doing these kind of non-standard things which could contribute to the risk being higher, but it's outside of their control to a great extent.
Can you talk a little bit about what you do when it comes to influencing the person who is slipped or could slip? So the customer or the employee. What are the sort of considerations there in terms of that communication?
So I think for people individually, it's about understanding that taking a bit more care is important. So of course, there's a responsibility on an employer or a place of work or a place where you're inviting public into the building to be safe. But we do have a certain level of responsibility as well. How to get that through to people at scale is difficult. So it's much easier to do that to staff within sort of toolbox talks or things like that. What I find works well is to try to pitch it in such a way that what they do themselves can help to protect their mates that they work with almost rather than themselves. Because I think people are more sort of apt to do things if they're looking after someone else in many cases than if they're just looking after themselves, because they kind of have this blasé attitude of, well, I'll be fine, it's fine, it won't be a problem for me. So things like, not distracting one another, moving items that could get in the way, cleaning and maintenance of floor surfaces to keep them in a safe condition. All of those things can be pitched in such a way that you're doing it to help your co-workers and your friends. And that seems to have quite a good effect from what I've seen.
So it's very much a sort of pro-social argument.
Yeah.
Because the bits that's interesting is that if on the face of it, you would think the most powerful argument would be to protect yourself, right? Because we're all inherently in the business of making sure that we survive. And so we'll look after it. But interestingly, you're saying actually when it comes to these things, a little bit of, I guess you could call it hubris or self-confidence kicks in, and therefore actually the pro-social message is more powerful in this context than the individual one.
Yeah, because people just don't think that it's going to happen to them in spite of the data. And that comes back to, what I said about the slip problem, the four big misperceptions that people have at a sort of corporate level as well. So people just kind of don't, unless they're confronted with a floor that they just walk on and they think, oh, that's not safe. And even then, people tend to just carry on. So they just don't think that it's relevant to them from the perspective of it won't happen to me. That's the big challenge. Whereas people can see the data and they can see it happening to someone else if you give them that kind of convincing point of argument. And that does tend to get them to act a little bit more quickly than saying, well, you've got to do this to keep yourself safe. Because, we do have this kind of, well, I know how to walk. I can, we can all walk on ice, right? We can all, if we lined up 100 people on an ice skating rink and said walk from one side to the other, probably all 100 would do it, but they wouldn't do it by walking how they normally walk. They'd be taking a lot more care and attention. Whereas if we had those 100 people on one side of the ice skating rink and we carpeted the first half of it and we blindfolded them and then they stepped onto the ice, they would all slip, right? So clearly that means that there's a human factor in play, because we can walk on this surface, but not if we don't know that it's there, and we can walk on this surface if we're concentrating and taking more care, but we can't if we're not doing those things. So it shows that there is a human factor there. But yeah, there is this kind of hubris that it won't happen to me.
Your ice skating rink story sort of made me think there's a TV show in that somewhere. But
it's like it's going to be the new episode of Squid Game.
Right. Exactly. There's something inherently amusing about people falling over. And if you think about sort of comedy, there's lots of sort of YouTube videos of people slipping, and there's something that makes us laugh about it. And I recognize it's an incredibly serious thing, right? Because people can get really seriously injured. But does that comedy element play into the way that you communicate it, people's approach to it? Does that figure at all?
Well, I try to avoid that because I think that it sort of helps to perpetuate some of these challenges around, it's not that serious. So I do try to incorporate a bit of humour here and there into my marketing, but I try to avoid, those kind of pratfall type scenarios. Now, don't get me wrong. Del Boy trying to lean on the bar and the bar was no longer there and only Fools and Horses. Everybody's going to laugh at that. But it's things like if you Google on or go on YouTube and you Google you search for slip and fall, you typically get these funny videos rather than some of these hard hitting statistics, and that's going to be very hard to change. So it's just about trying to rise above that, I suppose, and put together a sort of convincing proposition and argument that these things aren't inevitable, they're not simple, they're not so kind of paltry, they're not they are serious, and you can do something about it.
Because it always struck me that comedy, and I'd include things like sort of cartoon characters in this, can be a very effective way of communicating things. So if we think about airline safety briefings, many of them use cartoons to sort of transmit a very serious topic. But what you just pointed out there was, given this is something where the risk isn't properly understood, or at least it's downplayed if it is understood, actually bringing in comedy elements undermines the piece. And so here's a really good example of where our natural tendency to think, if we lighten up, make it fun and engaging, right, we'll get through to people. That's correct. But actually, here's an interesting example of something where that's unhelpful. And so we've got to actually, we're trying to drive this into the serious zone. So I guess potentially the answer to my question is that comedic element is incredibly unhelpful. And because people don't recognize the underlying risk, we have to treat this much more seriously. Is that a fair way to look at it?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I've actually got some comedic marketing planned, but it won't be showing people slipping and falling, and it won't be that side of things. It'll be a slightly different take on things. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes, because I do think that if you think about how to capture people's attention, right? Yes, you can be hard hitting, or you can be familiar. There's a lot of research on this, which I'm sure you'll be more familiar with, or you can be kind of entertaining, engaging, humorous. So to try and hit people on all of those, that whole spectrum is, I think, important. But it's just trying not to play on the stereotype or play on that kind of stereotypical view that this is a funny thing and therefore it's not serious. We can try to engage and entertain people and be a little bit humorous. But we can't we've got to strike that balance between doing that to get people engaged and not sort of cutting through the message of, this is a more serious problem than you expect and you can do something about it.
And how has working in this field impacted your personal behavior? Are you constantly on the lookout for this stuff? Are you walking? Have you changed the way you walk? How does your has it changed? It must have had an impact on you, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm certainly, I always say I've got really bad posture because I'm always looking down at the floor. It's nothing to do with watching too much TV or anything like that. No, it does change you because you start to notice these kind of risks
You're like the kid in the Sixth Sense, basically, when it comes to slips.
Yeah, I mean, look, if I cast my mind back to when I was run over, which was about 10 years ago, that was basically a car that was going too fast and lost control, mounted the curb, and ploughed into me. And I was obviously very unlucky that it happened, but very lucky that it wasn't much worse. And for certainly the first 6 months or so after that, I was incredibly, incredibly cautious about walking down the pavement, as you'd expect. And I was very perceptive of cars that appeared to me to be travelling faster than the speed limit. And I still am, but that has kind of deadened down a bit over time. I'm still very conscious of cars going too fast, and probably more so than most people. But certainly don't have that any kind of fear factor or about it or anything like that. I'm just aware of it. When it comes to what I do, I suppose because I'm still in it and I'm doing it day to day, I'm very much more aware of these risks, and so I am kind of always looking out for things, and I'll often take photographs or little videos just to remind myself, or to sort of use them as learning points for LinkedIn or whatever it might be. But I wouldn't say that when I'm sort of out and about in the world, I'm not sort of tapping the granny in Sainsbury's on the shoulder saying, you probably shouldn't be carrying those 2 bags because you might fall over. I'm not sort of taking it to that level.
No, it's funny you say taking those pictures, because I do the same thing, right? So I spot a sign that I think is clever, something that's sort of either, generally speaking, it tends to be stuff that's done really badly, right? As opposed to stuff that's done really well. It's easier to find those. But I've got myself into all sorts of trouble because people think you're a weirdo taking pictures of stuff. I've been sort of, why are you taking a picture of that? And I'm like, the time it would take me to explain.
Yeah, I was in Edinburgh Airport a couple of weeks ago, and since I've been there last, which was obviously pre-pandemic, at one of the entrances they've installed this massive entrance mat, and typically buildings have entrance mats that are far too small. And so I thought, oh, this is good. I'll take a photograph of this. But it was by the kind of departures area, so it was very busy. So I was standing there for ages with my camera out, trying to sort of capture a photo that didn't have too many people in it, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And I definitely got a few strange looks.
I think you say you got arrested for taking pictures of a secure area or something.
No, thankfully, never been arrested. But yes, I have. I mean, I remember, a few times we do a lot of work in leisure centres around swimming pools and places like that. And obviously, when you've got people in swimming costumes and you've got children and things like that, you're not supposed to be taking photos. So a few times where, maybe the general manager has welcomed me and then said, "Oh, crack on, have a look around." I go out and I'm sort of there taking photographs of the floor, obviously, but sometimes people will come up to you, not members of the public, but sort of lifeguards or whatever, and say, "What are you doing?" And you just have to explain, and then it's all fine.
And that's an interesting one because swimming pools. You would think, if you asked me who would understand this risk and do it well, answer would be I would just assume that swimming pools would be alive to this, right? Because logically, to my mind, they would see more of it. But it's fascinating that you say you work with them. So is it perhaps actually places that you wouldn't expect you would think would have a handle on this, but potentially don't? Is that a good example of sort of misjudging the risk?
Well, if you look across different sectors at accident and claim statistics, leisure, for example, slips is more than twice as big as the second largest cause of claims in terms of frequency of claims. So they understand that there is a risk. But again, going back to what I said about chimes, what we typically find is that they're just dealing with it in too superficial a way. And so they're not actually managing the risk as well as they could. So, for example, a swimming pool, you'll typically go in and find some kind of textured floor surface around the pool surround, right? Which is great. But the assumption then is, well, we've got a textured floor, it's safe. But actually the reality is, have they got any data to prove if that floor ever was even safe to start with? Because not every floor that has a texture is necessarily safe when wet. Are they cleaning that floor surface effectively to prevent a layer of contamination, such as calcium or limescale or body fats, which is a bit yucky, or even chemical residues building up on the surface and producing a barrier between the foot and the floor, which is going to be slippery? Are they lighting the area correctly so people can see hazards? Are they monitoring the temperature? Because obviously if we're hot, we might get a bit flustered, and then we might be our balance might be impaired slightly. So there's all sorts of factors, again, delving that level deeper, that they typically aren't doing as well as they might do. So we do a lot of work in that sector, but we do a lot of work in lots of sectors because that this risk is everywhere. Albeit that one of the key things we do say is we're only ever talking about maybe 5% of your floor surface area, if that, because 95% is not at risk. Because we're only talking about, like a poolside, areas that are likely to get wet or contaminated.
You talked earlier about the technology that's available now. Presumably we're getting better at managing this. So there's more ways you can mitigate it than existed in the past. So in theory, as we get more smart about things, we ought to be, this risk ought to be something that we could reduce and substantially reduce given modern advancements. Is that right? Is that the right way of looking at it? Or are there some fundamental things that have not shifted that much?
No, I think you're right. So let's just take H for heel. In the Chimes model, which is footwear. There have been some good advancements on footwear and lots more in the pipeline. If we look at the S surface, there's different ways of making surfaces inherently safer out of the box and more sustainably safer. There's also technology to treat floors that are not safe when wet, to make them safe when wet and still look nice, and so on and so forth. There's some interesting work being done around CCTV to be able to spot spillages on floors, so that rather than having to wait for somebody to happen to walk past and spot that spillage on the floor, you can actually use CCTV technology to spot it very, very quickly and therefore intervene. So that's going to be a game changer for that would be really relevant for the 95% of the floor that isn't routinely getting wet. The risk is only really when there's a spillage, but then if you've got a supermarket, for example, or a shopping centre, it's such a big area, you can't physically have eyes on every single area of the floor at every second. So bringing some tech in from that perspective would be useful. There's also some stuff around cleaning. So new methods of cleaning, new chemistry, new pads, new machines. So there's a lot of tech that is coming into place. What I would say, I guess, is that I think those will all have an effect, but I still think that we need to get back to this mindset piece first, because otherwise, we can put in place lots of different things on the shop floor, but if we still have this kind of mindset that these are inevitable, they're not that serious, we can't do anything about it, then that isn't going to produce a big enough shift that it will be sort of noticeable, if that makes sense.
And as you were talking about swimming pools and rest of that, I sort of struck. There are various phrases that come to mind that we've all seen. So slippery when wet. Mm-hmm. There's sort of signs and phrases that we used to seeing, and I wondered. I see why they're there from a legal perspective, that you've warned people. Is that kind of thing actually effective, or do we just zone out of that and sort of treat it? Because it always struck me that sort of telling me that the side of a swimming pool might be slippery, I can see why you do that, but that was unlikely to change my behaviour.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this. I interviewed a lady called Sarah Jane Brown on my podcast recently, and she now heads up Cornwall Council's COVID response team. But a few years ago, she was in their sort of environmental health and safety team, and she led a prosecution of Co-op after a gentleman slipped, banged the back of his head, and actually died in a Co-op store in Truro in 2015. And I actually kind of got involved in investigating that incident as well. And that resulted in a £400,000 criminal fine for the Co-op. And in her summing up after the court case, she said that, to paraphrase, this case should serve as a warning to retailers in particular that signage alone is not an adequate control. Floors either need to be safe to be walked upon when wet, or if they're wet, access to them, must be precluded. So what she's basically saying there is, this incident happened when a yellow floor sign was out, but that didn't stop the guy slipping, it didn't stop him banging his head, and it didn't stop him dying. And actually, the responsibility of the duty holder from a health and safety perspective is not to put a sign out, is actually to make the environment safe. So these signs are typically incorrectly used. People perceive, as you've done, that they're going to help you from a legal liability perspective, and in most cases they won't, because they're improperly used. So putting a sign out on a poolside to say slippery when wet, well, that's not going to help you at all, because it's designed to be wet. It's known to be, your duty is to make it safe in its intended use, which is that it's wet. So that's not going to be helpful. Whereas if you're using, if there's a spillage and you put a sign out and then you dry that floor and then you remove that sign, that's okay. If you've got a building entrance and it's raining and you just plonk some yellow floor signs in the middle of reception and you don't do anything else, that's not okay, because you're not actually dealing with, you're not confronting that risk. So I think that there's a lot of improper use and misunderstanding of what signage should be used for and circumstances in which it should be used. But also, as you say, people are just so desensitized to these signs. I mean, I remember sitting in St Pancras station. It was I don't know what month of the year it was, but it was a beautiful sunny day. And I was there for about 2 hours. I was making some calls and doing some emails, waiting for a train, sitting in a cafe. And there was a yellow floor sign right in the middle of the floor, just inside the entrance. And it didn't move for that 2 hours. And, tens of thousands of people walked past it. Nobody took any care or attention about it because, A, what's it doing there? And B, they just see these signs so often that people don't actually pay any heed to them, in my view. So I think we need to try and move away from signage, because it isn't effective. It isn't going to help you in most cases. And we need to be thinking about, is there something else we could do to try to help people to recognise this risk?
And I find in some cases it's deeply irritating, because you sort of, as you say, pointing out something. Well, what can I do about it, right? If I have to get across this thing to get somewhere, telling me that it's slightly, what steps am I supposed to take here? As really, hence slippery when wet. I sort of go, well, if it's wet, they're fine, but what can I do about that? And so, in many respects, I look at some of these interventions and I just think it's not only ineffective, it's deeply irritating. And actually makes me think differently about the authority that's imposing it, because I think it's an unrealistic expectation on their part, implicitly, that I'm going to be able to, over to you, manage it. I've told you about it, your problem. And of course, as you point out, that's not solving the problem.
No, it isn't, and that's not going to help you. I mean, if you think of it from the perspective of, again, I mentioned earlier that you can test how safe floors are when wet. So it gives you a number and a risk factor. Much of the time, what we see is floors that when they're wet, the risk factor might be 1 in 20. And what we try to do is help people to improve the floor surface to make that risk factor more like 1 in a million, even when it's wet. So therefore, rather than having to rely on 5% of people, as you say, to try to do something themselves proactively in order to avoid either slipping and or falling. And again, we can all walk on slippery when wet floors, where we can all also sort of start to slip and then self-address to not actually fall. But rather than having to rely on sort of 5% of people to do that, would it not be better to have to only rely on 1 in a million people to do that through some engineering, through some risk management, through some better control measures? And then actually those signs become redundant, because in my experience, people are only putting those signs out when the floor is known to be slippery when wet, but that isn't the solution. The solution should be, what can we do to stop this floor from being slippery when wet? Or, as Sarah Jane from Cornwall Council said, preclude access to that floor when it's wet, so that people aren't exposed to that risk.
And I love that, because I think there's a much broader lesson than just your specialism where this applies, which is sort of, rather than expecting people to be able to navigate around this, let's just recognize that that's difficult, and particularly where it's an environment that they're unfamiliar with, or just passing through, or have other things on their mind. And generally speaking, we will have other things on our mind when we do. If you want the different outcome, is rather than trying to affect the individual's behaviour, is just change the environment so that behaviour is automatically changed.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And going back to those risk factors, if you can know and have proof that your flaws are in that 1 in a million risk factor versus the 1 in 20, that's solving a problem at its root cause rather than relying on people. But also that will help you in the event of somebody, in spite of that, slipping and hurting themselves, to be able to defend yourself in the event of a claim or an insurance claim or a criminal prosecution as well. So you're hitting it from both ends that way as well. And I think you're right that, I mean, it's funny because I don't know if you've ever done this political compass.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm very central on there because I have I think economically I'm sort of to the right, socially I'm more to the left, but I'm slightly down a bit, which is more libertarian. But yet I'm here espousing, we've got to control this, we've got to control that. But actually, I think the point is that we can control things, but then we don't have to control the people. So I suppose that is maybe a bit more libertarian.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you're right. You're reducing people's choices and their ability, but you're also you're removing their liberty to fall over. Would be one way of looking at it, which is clearly not a good outcome.
I think everyone's happy with that.
Yeah. And I wondered, there's a lot of, we talked a lot about sort of what I'll loosely term remediation, right? So the existing design is not as fit for purpose as it could be. Is this something that's being factored into new buildings and new environments?
It is, and that's improved a lot in the last decade. So I've been doing this for about 12 years now. And certainly within the kind of architectural community and also the supply community, so tile, wood, laminate suppliers, there's a lot more knowledge than there was, and people are specifying better surfaces in the right kinds of areas. There's a little bit of over egging of that going on sometimes, so people are sort of putting in these kind of super grippy floors in areas which itself can produce some risks of sort of tripping rather than slipping. But on the whole, it is being done better, but nonetheless, we still get calls regularly of, we're opening this hotel in 3 weeks and we've just realized that we've put polished marble in the bathrooms and it's going to be slippery when wet. It's like, okay, no problem. So we are still seeing flaws in those design phases as well, but it is better than it was, for sure. I think that another area where we need to capitalize on one of the trends that's happening right now is around cleaning and maintenance. So with the pandemic, the importance of cleaning has never been higher, and we need to try and capitalize on that from the other aspects of safety that cleaning provides. So if you can clean a floor effectively, then you can keep it free from contamination and therefore reduce the risk of slips. And that's an area where in the past the trend has been towards driving down costs and cutting of hours, and actually now we're seeing the reverse of that. So hopefully that will continue, and that would have a big impact on the numbers as well.
And again, it's interesting when you talk about the bathroom floors. I mean, that comes down to somebody's made a design decision at presumably a relatively early stage, and this wasn't factored in. So even in the sort of what you're talking about there is, I guess my question is there's still room to push this further up the chain, getting people factoring this in at an earlier stage? Because when we think about, I guess if we looked at sort of, architectural design, we would be thinking about things like fire prevention as an obvious thing. So you design it in a manner that would have that baked in to start with. This, it sounds like, is something that there's still lots of room to go further up and to be speaking to the people very early on, because presumably you could make some decisions early on that would have implications for what you're looking at without necessarily realizing if you weren't alive to that challenge in the way that you would be for, say, fire regulations. Absolutely.
And what you've hit on there is regulation and the law. And the challenge with this area is that there's nothing black and white in the law which says this is safe and this is unsafe. There isn't that line in the sand. So whereas in other areas of safety, there are, so fire doors, there are regulations, you've got to achieve this certain level of protection through fire doors, and you've got to have these zones and so on and so forth. So that's something that I've been kind of campaigning for, and trying to get support for and coerce the government and the HC to do a bit more on this, because I think if we had, for example, a mandated slip test every year of buildings, that would really help, because if that was mandated and you had to achieve certain results, well, that's going to drive people to take action to achieve those results. And whether that is in building and specifying the buildings from the start, or whether that's managing an existing portfolio of buildings and trying to reduce the risk in the real world. So to me, that's something that we still need to address, because until we do that, we're still then on this kind of risk assessment based approach, which is fine, because I do believe in a risk assessment based approach. As I say, we don't need anti-slip floors everywhere. But I think just a bit more guidance, a bit of a line in the sand that's very clear to people would be helpful. And I think that would have a dramatic effect.
Is this a risk that would be easy to codify? So one of the arguments, and I suspect that's not the case here, but one of the arguments that you would come up with about why you wouldn't codify something is that it's difficult to do. And so you could end up with unintended consequences where people were, lawful but awful outcomes. Is this relatively easy to codify, or is there actually a challenge in that as well?
I think certain aspects of it are. So if we just look at the surface element, then it would be very straightforward to say, have a list of environments within a building. So I can think of, a kitchen, for example, a swimming pool, some showers, where we know without a shadow of a doubt the floor will get wet or contaminated, washrooms. And therefore, in those areas, I think it would make sense to say, well, look, these areas do require this certain level of slip resistance on the floor. It has to be monitored, it has to be maintained, and that's an obligation that you have. Whereas in other areas, you could find that you were getting into some trouble. So, receptions of office buildings, there's a big difference between the depth of matting, the amount of canopy, the type of doors you've got, which could mean that you need a certain level of slip resistance on the floor or not. So, those do need a more risk assessment based approach. But I think there is a list of areas in buildings where, to my mind anyway, we can make it black and white and very simple, and that would have a big effect.
I mean, again, it's something that I think I had naturally presumed would have been thought of, and so it's fascinating when I kind of come across you in your business to go, it is amazing that no one's really been focusing on this particular point. It's sort of been, it sounds like we're very close to self-regulation in many respects, which is, and therefore driven by legal risk as opposed to the underlying health and safety point.
Yeah, there's certainly something to that. And one of the trends is that the insurers and the lawyers are getting more up to speed with some of this technical stuff around the slip resistance and the chimes model and so on and so forth. I've been putting a lot of time and effort into that. Because if you think about it, if your insurer and your lawyer is saying, we want you to achieve X, Y, and Z standard because it'll mean you can defend claims, then actually it's almost irrelevant whether you stop accidents. You will stop accidents as well, but actually you're getting that unintended benefit of stopping the accidents by trying to defend or be in a position to defend the claim. So either way works for me. What I would say though is that generally there's a lot of emphasis placed on claims defensibility, and that can have a benefit. But remember, if you've got 100 claims a year, improving your claims defensibility might help you to defend another 5 of them. But actually, if you could be preventing accidents and improving your safety, then you might be able to reduce that 100 to 50, and that's going to have a much bigger effect.
And I guess again, it comes back to your perspective of how many of these things are you managing. Is there a sense that for some businesses, maybe this is just the cost of doing business, and for others, it becomes more critical? Is there a difference in perspective there?
I think that because it's a problem that has just gone on and on and on for so long without any real changes, that it basically is perceived as a cost of doing business by many people. And that's why it's important to talk about the implications of this and to get people to understand the true costs of these accidents. Because, for example, the average cost of an insurance claim for a slip is about £10,000. But not all of your costs are recoverable through your insurance. And the HSE would suggest that the true cost of an accident, the true bottom line cost of an accident, is something between 8 and 36 times the insurable risk element.
Wow.
So therefore, your £10,000 claim could be £80,000 on the bottom line in kind of, to use inverted commas, hidden costs. And people just don't sort of understand that. And they don't really, I think a lot of people also don't get the fact that, making people, I talk a lot about, the essence of what I do. And the essence of what I do is making people feel safer. And it's something that not a lot of people want to talk about necessarily. But for me, it's really important, because if you can make your team feel safer, they're going to perform better. They're going to stick with you for longer. They're going to be easier to manage. They're going to drive more profit for your business. If you can make your customers feel safer, they're going to be more relaxed. They're going to be more apt to return and to recommend their friends. And that's going to help your top and bottom line. So I think some of the elements around this, the implications, the so what, are really important. And it starts by a risk which is well known but seen as maybe something that isn't that important. But actually, if you can ask those questions in the right way, all of a sudden you can change that perception to make it something that is business critical. It's not easy, don't get me wrong, but that's what we need to do. We need to be having those conversations.
What are your top tips for people in their domestic or their work environment to make themselves safer?
So I think if it's you as an individual, I would say try and avoid being glued to your phone, and I'm guilty of that, as my wife and family will attest. I would consider your footwear, because you've got to remember what's in your control and what's not in your control. So consider the footwear that you're wearing, and just be aware of your surroundings and be attuned to the fact that these things can happen. And what we tend to see is that it's changes of floor types or across thresholds where most accidents happen. So you're walking on one type of floor, and walking is something that you don't think about, right? So you're just walking, and your body, you're doing it naturally. Your body expects that the next step is going to feel like the previous step. So when you're stepping on a floor and then all of a sudden it changes, your body's not expecting that. So just be aware of changes of level or changes of surface.
Amazing stuff. And if people want to get hold of you because you've roused their interest, how can they find you?
So I would say three things. I would say, firstly, you can check out my podcast, which you've appeared on very kindly.
Highly recommended.
Yeah, which is called the Safety and Risk Success Podcast. We're about 18 months in, 60 odd episodes, going from strength to strength. So that's certainly worth having a listen to. I'd say find me on LinkedIn. Very active on LinkedIn, and if you search Christian Harris, I should come up first, because I spend enough time on there that I must be friends with the LinkedIn algorithm gods. And then if you're interested in this kind of chimes model and understanding where you currently are on your slip and trip risks, then we've developed this kind of online diagnostic tool, which we call the Slip Safety Scorecard. You can find that on our website, and basically you answer a series of yes or no questions. It takes just under 5 minutes to complete, and then you get a score for each of the chimes, as well as an overall score. You get a report setting out all your scores and giving you some recommendations. And then you can have a one-to-one sort of Zoom with me for 15 minutes to do a deep dive. And I'll also be able to send you, I've partnered up with a number of different organizations to kind of give some free gifts, I suppose, to people that take this, that will help them to reduce their risk. So there's £1,000 worth of freebies you can get as well. So it's definitely well worth a 5 minutes investment.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you, firstly, for being the first Christian on the show, apart from me, which has been an absolute pleasure. Secondly, for the work that you do, because I think it's really the more I've dived into this, the more I think it's something that someone should be looking at, so that I'm really pleased that you are. And thirdly, thank you for being a great guest on the podcast.
My pleasure. Great to be here, and look forward to keeping in touch. And perhaps we'll try and get you onto my podcast again for my 2022 predictions show.
Fabulous. Would love to do that. Thanks a lot. So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Christian for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Christian's company, Slip Safety, the Chimes model, and Christian's Safety and Risk Success podcast, including the episode with me on it talking all things human risk, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the podcasting platforms. To find out more about human risk, visit human-risk.com. There you'll find details of the Human Risk newsletter, blog, video blog, and other resources to help you manage your human risk. You'll also find details of the work that I do with my clients on helping them to manage their human risk. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, try not to slip up, and thanks for listening.